This is episode 31 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Dowd Muska.
We're president and research director of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. Dowd, another busy week full of lots of happenings and the right to work data specifically for the last month. You've been so busy, we're just catching up with August data, but it was a great month for right to work in the month of August all around our great country. Tell us a little bit about those data points, and then we'll dovetail into an event we just had on right to work.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of folks out there who look for our monthly data, and I apologize for it being a little late in the month. Had something to do with the hard drive crash and the worst week of my life at the end of August. But I went back, Paul, and I was able to not recreate, but reobtain all those data. What we do is we look at the job announcements for investments. Sometimes these can be considerable investments, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, posted online by Area Development Magazine. That's a site, one of the leading site selection magazines. So we've been doing this. Paul, you've let me do this for over 3.5 years now, and we're just going to keep going because the information is really useful, and I think it reveals a lot. The jobs continue to flow to right-to-work states. Now, the right-to-work states have claimed a majority of those jobs every month since we started doing this over 3.5 years ago. And in August, it was 82.4% of those jobs going to right-to-work states. And the interesting thing about the data we look at is this is not overall job growth. These are the announcements put on this website. They tend to be things like logistics and warehousing, corporate headquarters, manufacturing facilities. There's a fair number of financial institutions that are expanding or relocating to research and development facilities. These are all solidly middle class and above jobs.
Yeah, nobody's putting out press releases for fry cooks at McDonald's.
As I say, landscape employees, minimum wage landscape guys, and home health care aides at the lower spectrum are never announced on this website. So we hear right to work for less. So if anything, these jobs should be flowing to the deep blue state, non-right to work states. And of course, that's not what we find. The most interesting metric I look at that's just fascinating to me, because I watched this in my native Connecticut, which has a lot of big multinational firms who continue to expand far outside Connecticut, is what I call the border crossing. When you have a corporate headquarters based in Cincinnati, Ohio, or Hartford, Connecticut, where are these big corporations putting greenfield facilities, or where are they expanding their existing facilities? 16-0 border crossers. That would be blue state, non-right to work, mostly big government states, expanding in right to work, lesser government, less tax burden states. 0 going across that border in the other direction. So pretty impressive in August, and that's in keeping with what we see. Foreign direct investment in this era of, I don't know if we're in a full board trade war, but we certainly have a lot of trade conflict and trade friction right now. Foreign direct investment still comes into this country 19-3 in terms of those investments being made in August. 19 right-to-work states, 3 non-right-to-work states. And Paul, what's so interesting, just in the last few months, we're starting to see a lot of these countries. When we first started doing this, it was mostly Europe. So it was France, the UK, even Italy. Canada was a big player, and Japan. Now we're seeing China's coming in a big way, but also countries you wouldn't think: Israel, Indonesia, Singapore is becoming more a player, bringing money into this country. So is that the Trump effect? Time will tell, I guess.
Well, and the foreign direct investment thing is so interesting because Michelle Lujan Grisham has specifically made that a point of her campaign for governor. And yet, of course, she is mortally opposed to right to work. Yet you say 19-3 in terms of the movement to right to work versus the investment in non-right to work states from foreign countries. And of course, we talked to Deborah Burns, who organized the big convention with Chinese and American business owners here in Albuquerque, really focused on New Mexico and trying to get Chinese firms to invest in New Mexico. How much more willing would they be to bring jobs and economic development here to the land of enchantment if we had a right to work law in the books?
It would be a major help, and it's also, I think, a good way. Our friend Don Boudreaux, unapologetic free trader Don Boudreaux, who we had out here recently in New Mexico, the notion that wages are the only reason the only thing companies care about, and that's why jobs are being shipped off to foreign countries. Well, that doesn't really explain all the foreign countries coming here. We have a lot to offer these companies, whether it's cheap natural gas, a less regulated economy, lower overall tax burdens, a more, well, maybe not these days, but overall a more placid political environment. We don't have a lot of coups in this country, so a lot of businesses based abroad continue to see the United States as a great destination and place to bring that money back, and it continues. I know Robert Lighthizer and Peter Navarro don't get it, but we do, Paul.
You got it. Well, speaking of right to work, we were just in Ruidoso, New Mexico as panelists for an Americans for Prosperity event on right to work, in which we shared the stage with some luminaries, including John Boyd, our podcast guest for last week, Jim Waters, the head of the State Policy Network think tank in Kentucky, the state that began the push for local government right to work, and of course then went right to work at the state level, and some of the amazing results they've been having. Of course, we had some New Mexico politicos show up, including State Senator Bill Scherer, Candy Spence-Ezell, state representative from Roswell, and the lead sponsor on right to work in the New Mexico House for many, many years, and Senator Stuart Engel as well, who also shared his lengthy experience in the New Mexico legislature pushing for right to work. And it was a very interesting event. I thought, of course, Boyd, the site selector, the guy that's actually got the finger on the trigger for these companies, telling them, where they should go and locate their next plans and invest hundreds of millions of dollars. Any guy like that is going to have tremendous credibility and tremendous, just street cred with any group of people who are considering public policy decisions. And we don't agree with him on 100% of issues. We don't like those incentives, but he's realistic about those incentives and their role, but he really emphasizes right to work. Any other takeaways you had from that event?
Well, I was very impressed with him, and I think Boyd, I think is aligned with us probably on just about everything about incentives. And again, if you listen to our podcast we had with him last week, the notion of what we hear from liberal politicians is we have to pour more money into our education system. And Boyd, like me, because I look at the data and he has his clients, that's a very simplistic interpretation. Companies are willing to do their own training. Companies are willing to relocate people. Education, percentage of your population that has a college degree, that kind of stuff. You see places that are not real stellars when it comes to education. Tennessee, I think, is probably our best example, just booming. And so it's interesting to get his perspective on that. And Jim Waters, I was tremendously impressed with the guy from Kentucky who's been through that right to work fight. And as I said, he was going to be on hand to correct I was doing a comparison of Kentucky and New Mexico, and he was on hand to correct my bad data that I had on Kentucky. But I think mostly he thought I was right. I was doing
I saw him taking pictures of your slides. That is, to me, an indicator that he really found it informational in some of those comparisons you made. And we'll talk about that in a second. But Mr. Boyd in particular, a site selector, I think he is philosophically in line with us. He wants to see his clients succeed, of course. I mean, it's a very self-interested thing. I think you also have to have an intuitive understanding of economics to do the job that he has. And something he said in his presentation really stuck with me, which is, he's from New Jersey, a state not known for tremendous governance. And he said, look, in the interim, states like New Jersey that have real hostile business climates, if they want to be in the running for any of these companies, from Amazon on down, they have to use the incentives essentially to cover up for the many, many flaws in their public policy climate. However, they should be working to reform their tax code, to reform their pensions, to adopt right to work laws, to do all the things that will make you inherently friendly to business. And I think that really is a critical aspect of what he's saying. The incentives are an issue of diminishing returns. You can only offer so many of those incentives until the well runs dry. Whereas a state like Texas, to have a zero income tax, to have a right to work state, to have a relatively benign regulatory environment, all those things don't really cost you anything, cost the taxpayers your state. So you can just offer those And then, maybe the incentives, to the extent that they help anything, can be used to kind of close the deal. But if I'm Texas, I say, look, here's what we got, policies beyond compare, and come on down to Texas. And I think that's a winning argument for.
Well, I was glad to hear him talk about I was trying to highlight the fact that Kentucky and New Mexico have, what they have in common is they don't have those high costs of things like electricity and natural gas that you have on the coast, because you have very deep blue, big government places that just make life hell to produce and sell energy. And John Boyd, it's interesting. I mean, he doesn't make a living unless he meets his clients' needs. It's one that you could say the Rio Grande Foundation is out of touch and they're a think tank and they have no connection to reality. Here's a guy whose his livelihood, he has to, what did President Bush say? In order to put food on his family, he has to go out and meet his clients' needs, and his clients are telling him they prefer right to work. It's right there.
Well, let's compare a little bit briefly, New Mexico and Kentucky. Obviously, significant geographical differences between the two, some other major differences. Why don't you briefly go through some of those most relevant comparisons between Kentucky, which, again, has seen phenomenal success, and the number of jobs and the investments that Jim Waters cited is just incredible. Kentucky is really doing very well since it went right to work, and the counties that did go right to work have seen tremendous success since then. Any of those data we would be thrilled to have here in the land of enchantment. But talk a little bit about the comparisons you made in your presentation.
Well, the big one, Paul, after the fact that I didn't mention, it was really interesting to me, is Kentucky has a higher percentage of its workforce unionized than New Mexico, yet they were able to, county by county, and then eventually statewide, adopt a right to work law, which means maybe the unions, we shouldn't fear them politically as much as we do. They certainly were defeated in that state. But I guess I'll start with the good news. I mean, New Mexico has generally cheaper energy costs. I mean, we're in an energy volcano of energy. The state has more energy than any place in the country. I mean, from uranium to, if you want to be a lefty and be wind and solar. So we have great energy costs. We have much better weather. Kentucky is a rainier and snowier and less sunny place. But the big thing that stood out, despite Kentucky's degree of self-destructiveness, very high obesity rate, one of the highest in the country, diabetes rate, I think number 2 or number 3 in smoking. So Kentucky has some self-destructiveness, but I don't think you can compare any state's self-destructiveness to New Mexico. I mean, this week we saw the new data coming out that crime in 2017 actually got worse. We're still number 1, I think, in property, number 2 in violent crime. We're number 3 in the country for our illegitimacy rate. I think we're number 4 for suicide. We have a tremendous cultural problem in this state that I think rightly repels a lot of site selectors, and of course not right to work. And we have one of our favorite hobby horses, because it's very significant, a gross receipts tax that is far more complex and Byzantine and causes more compliance problems than Kentucky. So we have some similarities. We're flyover country, and if you really look at site selectors, they're preferring flyover country. They want to stay away from New York and Connecticut and in California because of those high costs. But, our challenges are significant in the state, and we have a political culture that is really not interested in being frank and open about, not even discussing the problems, much less implementing so-called controversial solutions to address them. We got a long way to go, and as we say, Paul, you and I have job security.
And something Jim Waters, again, the think tank president there in Kentucky, who was kind enough to fly out to New Mexico, to Ruidoso even, and talk on a panel. He cited the importance of work and gainful employment as a means of alleviating some of those social ills. Now, you're not going to solve all the social challenges that we face, divorce rates, et cetera, but some of the drug, the suicide, the crime, if you give people or have opportunities and actually encourage them to work instead of encouraging them not to work by, say, increasing the minimum wage and reducing or offering generous government benefits in the form of welfare payments, you have more people in the workforce that maybe it's not themselves that's having a much better life, but their children who learn and see from watching their parents in the workforce having gainful employment, and the kind of the self-esteem that comes with that it's a generational thing. If you want to break that generational poverty issue, which Lord knows both Kentucky and New Mexico have in spades, and I would encourage anyone listening to this podcast to read the fine book, Hillbilly Elegy, which there's a lot of New Mexico in that book, even though the guy in it is from Kentucky. It really talks about getting that generational poverty issue addressed. And it's not just the inner cities of our country that have it. It's right here in New Mexico and in places like Kentucky as well.
Well, just what you just said, Paul. John Boyd piggybacked on that and said, "Yeah, cultural problems are a real issue for site selection in companies, but one of the best ways to solve that is economic growth." And Paul, you've said, and I agree with you, because nothing is being done on the ground here in New Mexico to make the state a more attractive place. If anything, if you look at the local level recently, we're just seeing tax hikes. The Santa Fe is doing nothing. The national economy, as you said, is dragging New Mexico into a recovery. I mean, we're down to our lowest unemployment in I don't know how long it's been. So
4.6%. It's as low statistically as it's been, but as you rightly cite, we're still one of 3 states that are down in terms of job creation since the Great Recession.
Well, I'm doing some initial looking now at the so-called recovering economy in New Mexico and how that relates to our food stamp rolls and our Medicaid rolls. A couple of years ago, people were saying we were going to get to 50% Medicaid in the state. We seem to have maxed out in the low 40s, which is actually encouraging. Maybe some of that growth is helping that. I'd like to see it go down maybe to the high 30s even and be really stellar that way. But can economic growth grab the low-hanging fruit and get the people who are sort of on the margins into the mainstream of society in better circumstances and provide those opportunities? We're gonna be watching that in the months and years to come.
Well, one policy that is sure to not move the needle in any way, shape, or form, in fact, it will move it in a negative direction when it comes to economic success, comes from Las Cruces, which they have developed a double down policy on New Mexico's failed film incentives, and it's not in place yet. And one of the only silver lining I can even think of about the program is that it wouldn't be a new source of money. It'd be diverting an already wasteful boondoggle-ish program of involving the lodger's tax. But the idea is to add a new incentive on top of the existing film subsidies. Yay.
It's really remarkable. Paul, the city of Las Cruces, south central New Mexico, is jealous because all those wonderful film and television jobs are going to Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And if you look regionally, one thing that the film office, the film bureaucracy in the state does pretty well is it'll literally map you, where the productions are, and they tend to be heavily concentrated in greater Albuquerque and Santa Fe. They're not getting their film pork down in Las Cruces, so this has been a crusade led by Senator Jeff Steinborn, a man with no experience in the film and television industry. And as far as I can tell, Paul, he's no experience in the for-profit industry at all. He's the Southern New Mexico director of the New Mexico Wilderness Alliance, former Bingham employee, former Richardson employee, lifetime government hack. So he's spearheading this. They signed a memorandum of understanding with a nonprofit organization that literally was not even a corporate entity at the time, several years ago, called Film Las Cruces. Coincidentally enough, Jeff Steinborn is the board of directors president of Film Las Cruces. So the taxpayers down there have been paying $95,000 a year for the last 3 years to support this nonprofit entity. They have been named, one of their officials has been named the local liaison. The state film office has what's called the Statewide Film Liaison Network. And that's the point person down there. They've had 3 people in this job in the last 3 years. They can't seem to maintain a staff down there, but I guess with Steinborn as your president, he's a great leader. So Steinborn's underway. He's been trying to bring capital outlay. They want a big film infrastructure. They want to build a studio down there, a significant studio. Right now they have a very little small outfit that Doniana Community College and the city and Las Cruces, Film Las Cruces have built. It's the former Coca-Cola bottling plant, which as a fan of Coca-Cola, Paul, I take that as a personal insult to move from Coca-Cola, a good product, to welfare, corporate welfare. So that's the capital. That's the long-term plan. But as you say, they are considering, a plan has been drafted by their economic development staff. This would add a 10% benefit for all qualified expenses, quote, and the state determines what's a qualified expense.
This is piggybacking on the New Mexico subsidy program, which
can be 25 or even up to 30%, depending on the type of production. So
just to be clear, if this were to be enacted in the city of Las Cruces, if you filmed a TV program, which at the state level gets a 30% reimbursement, so of your expenses, 30% are reimbursed right now, that bumps that to 40% if you do TV in Las Cruces, and 25% is what it is at the film, non-recurring TV shows. That would take it to 35% in City of Las Cruces.
But
So
this expense will be more than worth it, Paul, because, for example, according to the media coverage down there, for this subsidy, the film production company or video production company would agree to allow the city to disclose that the filming was occurring in the city and include the city in promotions for the film. And I think that alone would just revive Las Cruces' economy.
oh, amazing, amazing. Yeah, that's everybody around the world looks for that Las Cruces stamp of approval.
I mean, as you said, Paul, they're doubling down on a failed policy. We recently had an op-ed placed in a number of papers throughout the state, really looking at our assessment of this and just objectively looking at the federal employment data. It is a failure. It is an extremely expensive failure. We know that politicians love to have their pictures taken with Julia Roberts or whoever. It's not translating into real economic development. And what happens is, and Hollywood does this all over the country. They come in, they grab whatever cash they can get, and they get out, and they don't build permanent infrastructure because most of that infrastructure, whether it's the post-production stuff, whether it's the studios, that exists in California and New York, and it's not leaving California and New York in any significant way.
Well, it's unfortunate that the folks down in Las Cruces seem to be moving in such a unfriendly economic direction.
With Jeff Steinborn leading the point, I'm sure they're on the path to progress, Paul.
And it just shows you that El Paso, despite El Paso is a blue city, you look on a map and that is not a rock rib conservative community by any stretch of the imagination. But compared to Las Cruces, El Paso, partially guided by state policies coming from Texas as a whole, the state capital in Austin, they have been able to economically outperform Las Cruces time and time again. And if this policy is implemented, it will only be a starker difference in comparison between the two.
All I could say to the Las Cruces community is just get out and make your question this heavily. Go to your counselors, ask them to justify this. Look at our research. Look at other people's research. It's not an economic development winner. It's a sucker's bet, and it could be an expensive one.
Dowd, the Journal had some additional polling this week.
You and your polls, Paul.
I do love the polls because I think especially as we hit this election, it is so important to understand because we do live in this republic that has many aspects of a democracy, and we could talk about that another time, but public opinion is relevant, and the public opinion polling that is on display from the Albuquerque Journal is pretty bracing stuff. Very serious or somewhat serious problem. 96% of New Mexicans say that crime is either very serious or somewhat serious. That is called a landslide, overwhelming, unbelievable. What are the other 4% doing or thinking? 78% say it's a very serious problem, which by itself is a stunning number. 18% say somewhat serious. Crime is, of course, the overriding issue facing New Mexico right now, and we'll have a little bit of a conversation at the very end about our bail reform event coming up. But the Rio Grande Foundation has limited capacity to take on crime issues. A lot of it is not easy to get to the bottom of. There's a lot of cultural aspects to it, although I would point back to the extent that you can have productive economic jobs and employment as opposed to the low workforce participation, high welfare rates that we have in this state. Demand people to actually get to work, and many of them will rise to the occasion. We need to reinstate that philosophy in our society. Now, an issue that the Rio Grande Foundation has a much bigger footprint on is public school education. 68% say it is a very serious problem. Overall, 92%, if you include somewhat serious and very serious, 92% say our public school system is a serious problem. That is another astounding, overwhelming statistic. Now, we of course had this judge decision saying, oh, we need to dump more money into it. Of course, as you and I know, we're already dumping more money into education. I don't see the current discussion and the current trends in Santa Fe pushing us in a direction towards any useful reforms. It looks like more money is the problem, maybe peeling back the governor's accountability tools and measurements, those systems, standardized testing, A through F grading, I don't think they were implemented well, but we don't see any discussion, Congressman Pierce, for example, of school choice. Even our friends at Think New Mexico have this philosophy, this idea of forcing the schools to dedicate more of their money, the spending that they have, into the classroom as opposed to their bureaucracy and other purposes. So unfortunately, I don't see this public school discussion going in any fruitful direction. I mean, maybe Pierce will get in there and surprise us and start talking about school choice, because we've discussed at length how his campaign has been very milquetoasty. But with this and I'll ask it this way, Dowd. With 92% of New Mexicans concerned deeply about our education system, don't you think this is the kind of issue in a gubernatorial campaign that somebody could really run with?
Other than crime, those are the two. Those are the two. And we're at a point, Paul, and you mentioned the judicial ruling. For people who maybe took the summer off a couple of months ago, we had a judge, Sarah Singleton, on her way to retirement, rule that the state's constitutional commitment to serve the educational needs of, I believe it was low poverty, non-English speaking tribal students, was inadequate, and she wants a big chunk of money. And that ruling could not be coming at a worst possible time, because we have a substantial budget surplus, which you've been here a lot longer than I have, Paul. No matter who's the governor, there's going to be tremendous pressure from the legislature to say, well, that's what we're going to do with the surplus. Let's not use it for anything really useful. We've been ordered by a judge. We have to comply. Hopefully, a Governor Pierce would be more resistant to that. I think we can be completely confident that a Governor Lujan Grisham will be enthusiastically behind that. Yeah. So I hate to say that we're happy. I say that we're disappointed in the budget surplus situation, especially the rough couple of years we've had in this state. But it's a perfect storm of educrat, government unionized monopoly schooling disaster down the road, and it's not a light at the end of the tunnel. It's the oncoming train that scares the heck out of me.
And add in the pre-K demands.
Sure,
and
that'll be a big part of it.
All the efforts, and of course, Governor Martinez, to her discredit, pushed and allocated much more money into the pre-K system. Of course, as we cited a few weeks ago in this podcast, American children already spend a relatively very high number of days in the education system. Perhaps adding another year or two onto that is not the solution we're looking for. Quick on the polling again, the economy. Interesting to note that 35% now say it's a very serious problem, but if you add very serious and somewhat serious, you still get 78% who are concerned about the economy. Now, crime is like a 12-alarm fire. I mean, it's definitely a blazing issue with people. Education was maybe not entirely surprising. I think education's always an issue in New Mexico, and if anybody comes up with a bold, interesting plan that it could achieve some real success in an election. So all you legislator wannabes and candidates for office listening out there, education and innovative solutions could be a real boon to you. And then homelessness, 54% say it's very serious, 35% say it's somewhat serious. So that adds up to 89%. So a lot of problems here in the land of enchantment. And,
other than that, we're doing fine.
Yeah, gosh darn it. I'm not saying we have awesome solutions for all of these, especially the crime and homelessness. Those are two very intractable issues. But this land of enchantment, despite an economic boom, both nationwide and in the Permian Basin, a lot of serious challenges out there.
Well, Paul, I would just say keep doing what you're doing. You'll keep getting what you're getting. And this is not a political statement, but there's certainly been an ideology, an approach to public policy in New Mexico since the 30s, since the Great Depression. And, Republicans have been a big part of this too. Democrats lockstep that government is the answer, federal pork is the answer, universal preschool is the answer. It's the knee-jerk solution that somehow government, wise men and women appropriating money, will solve the problems in this state. I guess I just say the old Dr. Phil. How's that working for you?
Yeah.
Not
well,
great.
To take another phrase, James Carville, the vision thing, that especially among our Republican friends tends to be such a challenge because they may often vote right. They may ultimately do the right thing or the wrong thing, depending on the issue, but they don't seem to have a very compelling alternate vision from the current reality for people. And maybe that's just because the culture here is kind of conservative in a small C,
Sure.
leaning against change. Former State Senator Dede Feldman has some misguided ideas on the issue of campaign finance reform. That's her high horse, really, that she's been out on since she retired from the New Mexico Senate. And you had a opportunity to shine some light on where she goes astray. And this particular issue is not, necessarily the traditional right-wing funding sources, but Gary Johnson, the libertarian running for New Mexico's Senate seat, and his funding sources. So talk to us a little bit about what Dede Feldman's up to.
Well, Dede Feldman does not like Citizens United, Paul. I think that's one of the left's bête noirs, right up there with the Koch brothers lately. And she wrote an op-ed, as you said, former state senator. Was she from the Albuquerque area?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
She mentioned that a super PAC that Gary Johnson announced his senatorial run at an event sponsored by a super PAC, one of those evil super PACs. And she just had some selective information. She got the court case wrong. It's not actually Citizens United versus FEC that enabled super PACs. It was Speech Now versus FEC, but why let little details like that matter? She said there are, prior to the horrible decision Citizens United, when the evil Supreme Court threw open the door to corporate interests, quote, there were safeguards in place that both required transparency and limited the ability of corporate interests to influence elections. And it's always interesting to hear the left talk about corporate power and corporate giving to campaigns when they don't want to talk about union giving, Paul. And in the 2016 election...
Unions are not political, Dowd.
Not at all. Only to the tune of about $1.3 billion in the last election cycle. That was from union treasury. So that's forced dues primarily. And I said, not just forced dues, but I guess ignorant dues. People are not even aware that this stuff is being done. So they give their own PAC contributions and soft money, but $1.3 billion from their treasury. So she never mentioned anything in that whole piece attacking Gary Johnson about that. And also the issue of corporate interest is fascinating to me, about how they have inordinate power, as if corporations are monolithic, Paul. And the example I used on our blog, Errors of Enchantment, does ExxonMobil have the same legislative agenda as Tesla? I would think they would have the opposite legislative agenda. They're both corporations, right? It is this incredibly simplistic view by the McCainiac campaign finance reformers, their view of reality. It's very rare, Paul, when we are debating our enemies on an issue, that we can find zero common ground. You can always find something here or there, criminal justice reform. When it comes to the campaign finance reformers, they are in toto wrong about everything. Wrong about the law, wrong about the Constitution, wrong about the numbers, wrong about the political process. And it's just disturbing to see this kind of stuff. I put in a great quote from a professor, former professor at Johns Hopkins, John Samples. He's with the Cato Institute. I've talked to him a bunch of times. His book, The Fallacy of Campaign Finance Reform, is probably the best thing I've ever written about campaign finance reform. Beneath all the pious talk about equality, fairness, and the integrity of the process lies this unpleasant truth. Those who write campaign finance laws seek primarily to repress and harass those who would challenge their power. Sometimes they do it to preserve the power of their party, and almost always they do it to sustain the power of incumbents. And no truer words have ever been written about the misguided attempt to control political speech in our country.
All the corporate offices I've ever been to, Dowd, they have big bookshelves full of Milton Friedman, F.A. Hayek, Ludwig von Mises books. They really only look at how can we impose the free market upon our society. That is what the corporate
major corporations are the leading opponents of corporate welfare in this country, right?
Oh, absolutely. They talked to John Boyd about that one. Site Selector, who is realistic because he gets paid by these companies and does look for corporate welfare as part of his job, even though he understands the power and the importance of the free market. Unfortunately, our corporate friends out there, such as they are, don't necessarily have principles. They have bottom line interests. And if I always, my favorite thing to say about campaign finance is that you, instead of keeping money out of politics, which it will never, ever be, keep the politics out of money. And that means that if your path to profit and success is through getting a lobbyist and an appropriation or a subsidy from the legislature or the federal government, that indicates a problem with the political process, not a problem with the corporation. The corporation is just doing what they can do to pad their bottom line. And they would be remiss if they didn't try to do those things. As much as we at the Rio Grande Foundation are immensely frustrated with them, look at the film subsidy program and all the companies that benefit from that, major corporations. I don't think Feldman,
and unions.
Feldman really doesn't talk about the evil film corporations and how they manipulate the
or
process.
green corporations giving big subsidies. He doesn't care about those. We want it all stopped, no matter who.
Yeah. And finally, back to the crime issue, which, as the voters of New Mexico say, is a deadly serious problem, and that is a understatement. 96% say very serious or somewhat serious crime issue in the land of enchantment. On October the 4th, the Rio Grande Foundation and the Justice Action Network are sponsoring a panel discussion on the recently enacted and ever so controversial bail reforms. Brett Tolman, the former U.S. Attorney for the District of Utah, David Iglesias, former U.S. Attorney for the District of New Mexico, and Daniel Ivy Soto, a New Mexico State Senator from Bernalillo County. Again, October the 4th, those panelists will be discussing this important bail reform issue, its impact on the crime issue that bedevils all of us, 6 to 7:30 p.m. Again, that's Thursday, October 4th. You can find out more at riograndefoundation.org. Click on our calendar and sign up for free there. It's a free event, and you can check that out. I encourage folks to attend. If you have any questions or concerns, give us a call, 505-264-6090.
Paul, there's been a lot of demagoguery on this issue, and I think we're going to have a night of great enlightenment by some real experts in this field. People are going to be better informed after attending this.
I'll just say that I was on a phone call to help coordinate and kind of introduce everybody, and the knowledge that will be dropped at that event will make everybody very, very knowledgeable about the issue of bail reform.
And no one running for office on the panel. So we'll get to the facts.
Yeah, Daniel Ivy Soto, he is a New Mexico Politico, but he has 2 years to kind of go before he gets to run for office again. Thank you so much for listening to this week's interview. We're working every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to riograndefoundation.org for more information or to support our work.